Hi. So this is the second video in the Machinist release number 3 series. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the code for the new features in Project Machinist release. The first feature that we saw in the video was the authentication. We can view the authentication by going in a private window and navigating to the main URL of the app, and we're going to be presented, of course, with the sign-in screen. How this is actually coded is the entire app is wrapped in a component called Authenticator. The Authenticator component basically locks down the app such that any of the URLs that you try to access for the app, including the root URL, are going to be blocked behind this sign-in screen. If you log in, what's going to happen is the library that we're using for authentication is going to save your sign-in token to your browser's storage, and next time you come to the page, you will be authenticated with that same token. Once you are past the Authenticator component, we can dive into the code for the 3 new features that we've added. First of all, the code for the top bar is written in a component called topbar.tsx. So in the top bar component, we basically have an add design menu, and add design is the component library that we're using. So we have an add design menu with 3 menu items in it. The first menu item is the save button. What the save button does is it basically has a modal dialog, which is a very simple enter file name dialog. And the handlers for this dialog box, when you click OK, it will actually take the state of this graph, so the drawing that you have over here on the canvas. It will reach into that state store, which can be done with the useGraph hook. So it will reach into that state store, grab the graph, which is this drawing over here, and then it's actually going to pass the graph into a function called save machine. So this save machine function is part of our service.ts. And how the service works is it's basically just a bunch of functions that we can use for making the different queries over the network or to Amazon and doing things like that. We package up all that code into this service. So the function that we called was save machine. And what that function does is it takes the file name that you provide as well as the graph, which can be injected into the function from the useGraph hook. It takes that machine and it basically just does a little bit of cleanup on the JSON. So it extracts a few of the fields from the JSON, and then it sends that to Amazon. And how it does that is using this storage library. So this is a library that's released by Amazon for use on front-end apps. And what it does is after you configure this library, you can connect to a user's storage that's associated with your app, and that storage is an account on a service called S3. So what S3 service does is it basically stores files. So what we're doing when we save the machine is we're serializing this entire graph, and we're throwing it onto AWS on the S3 service. So we're going to save a file on there with the contents of this graph serialized as JSON. We also have a load machine function in the service.ts, and what the load machine function does is the opposite of save machine. So this function calls storage get, and it takes the file name for the machine that you want to load, and it actually does the opposite. It parses the JSON, so it deserializes it back into the actual graph that we need. And then what you can do is simply take this graph and save it to the graph store, which is a global data store across the entire app. So any component can load a machine and save it in the graph store, and the graph will be automatically updated on the canvas. The next item in the top bar is the file storage. When you click on the file storage, this opens another modal, but how this modal works is it also uses storage. So again, we're using the files that are on AWS, that are on S3, and are associated with our specific user. So these are actually files that are private to this user. And the modal, the functionality in this modal dialog is all hooked up to calls to the storage library. So when we want to upload files, we can storage.put, and when we want to list all the users' files, we can storage.list. And all that this modal does is it basically just invokes storage library to list, delete, and do all sorts of things to the files. What we saw earlier with that load machine function, that function is actually called in this file manager. So what we've done is we've set up a double click handler in the table. When you double click on one of the rows, we've configured a handler that calls load machine. And what it does is it simply takes the file name of the record that you've double clicked and it throws that into the load machine function, which, as we've seen before, will call the storage library, grab the JSON for the machine, deserialize that JSON, and then after we've deserialized that JSON, all that it does is it throws it into our state store, into the graph data store, which is global. How we can do that is using a dispatch function where we're basically just tossing in whatever we've deserialized from Amazon. So the JSON data that we got, deserialized it, and we're tossing it into our data store. That's the second item in the top bar. The final item in the top bar is our accounts page. The accounts drawer over here, what this drawer does is it's hooked up to the auth library, which is another library that's released by Amazon for interacting with a service called AWS Cognito. So Cognito is our authentication service that we're using. How this authentication service works is we use this library and we've got the sign in, the sign up that's configured globally at the top level of our app. And when we want to manipulate the details of this user, we've just hooked up some handlers that invoke the auth library to do things like setting the profile pic, setting the email address, and various different things like that to change the details of their user account. The profile pics are saved using the same storage library as we saw with the machine JSON files. The only difference with the profile pics is that we've actually hard-coded a file called profile.png. So this profile.png, it's actually not accessible from the user's file manager. So you won't see profile.png in here, and it's actually not possible to save a file called profile.png to the user's account. At least not a file that overlaps with the one that we're using for the profile pic. So this file is basically unique for every user, and they don't really have access to it other than editing the file over here and viewing it, of course, in their avatar. So those are the new features that we've added, and that's just a little glimpse into how it's coded. So thank you for watching this video, and see you around.